As Charlie said, the difficulties with regional statistics are well known. The national concept is reasonably precise. People are either in one country or in another country. Cross-border transactions are fairly well defined. Even if we don't monitor every trade flow all the time, things have been reasonably straightforward. Possibly with the development of the service economy, they've got less, and international trade in services, they've got less straightforward. But no, the national concept is reasonably clear. Once you start looking at smaller and smaller geographies, the problems become more and more acute in terms of the relevance of the concepts. Most households have a primary place of residence. You can say where you live or where you normally live, and those can be located to, for most of us, a very precise geography. For businesses, that's less clear. Businesses have a single address, but if you were to ask Sainsbury's or Tesco's where you carry out most of your business, they obviously are operating nationwide, and as Charlie mentions in his review, they can easily provide statistics for their national operations. Providing regional statistics is rather harder. Surveys as data sources. Well, anyone who has tried to use the valuable surveys that the ONS produces notices that you start off with what looks like a rather large sample. As you hone down to the group that you're interested in, the sample size shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, and when you're interested in, say, old people in one particular part of the country, in some surveys perhaps the sample size is so small that you aren't really sure how informative it is. So, as Charlie said, reliance on sample surveys can take us only so far, but one can't expect them to be a source of good and reliable regional data. Well, the ONS has done work on geographic interpolation, and I'd come to the area from a slightly different side, temporal interpolation, producing estimates of monthly GDP. The statistics look rather similar. You identify covariates that you know at the local level or the high frequency level, and explore how those relate to the national concept. Now, that works fine on in the round, but whereas no one is going to misapply policy because there happens to be a random fluctuation in your estimate for monthly GDP in July 2014, when you start looking at geographic at local estimates of, say, income, local estimates of living conditions, if those are estimated from covariates, there will be some geographies, some local areas for which they actually give rather bad results, and that's, I think, perhaps it's just a consequence of the problem that we have to live with. Well, Charlie mentioned the importance of administrative data. I must say, for the reasons that I mentioned, it seems to me that perhaps most could be gained. I was going to say most can be gained quickly, since I've never tried working with PAYE data. I don't know what can be gained quickly from them. But it seems to me that because people have a single address, most could be gained perhaps from PAYE data and, of course, benefit data. Because when benefits are paid to people, the government, one hopes, knows where they actually live. So we probably can get there somewhere, but and we can probably make some reasonably good progress. But my sense is that the problems of regional data, the desire to know more about the regions and particularly small geographies than we actually do, is nevertheless likely to be something that is going to be an issue that we're hearing about again in a rather different context in, say, 50 years' time. Now, we have two speakers today. Andrew Harvey is going to talk about improving access to subnational data, and he'll be followed by Alan Harding, who'll talk about beyond gross value added from a local perspective. So Andrew, please.
Thank you very much for that, Martin. As Martin said, I'm going to give you a perspective, I think, on from a data user perspective, more than a data production, and how we at the Centre for Cities try to use a lot of the data that is produced by ONS and by other data producers as well, and then some of the challenges associated, many of which have been rehearsed already, and then undoubtedly, some of the things I've got to say around how we might overcome those have already been picked up by our previous speakers as well. But just to give you a sense as to where we are, and you'll notice the first thing I've done in a classic way in interpreting the particular talk is not actually to talk about regions, to talk about cities. And that's not just a semantic kind of change of terminology. I think there is something substantive around when we think about how an economy, particularly a modern economy like the UK and indeed other modern economies work, thinking about cities and city regions and how we can capture information about what's going on at that level, I think is increasingly as important, if not more important, than thinking about when we talk about the old traditional regions, particularly how regions have been applied in the UK. And the point is when we look at and we aggregate and we pull together some of the basic stats, whether we're looking at jobs, whether we're looking at population, whether we're looking at where our skills are located, where we're looking at where our migrants typically live, it's our cities that are driving much of the national economy. So there's a reason to think about our cities, because they matter when we think about the UK as a country, as an economy, as a society. And you definitely won't be able to see that at the back, but the point here is one of the stark things, not exclusive to the UK, but it is a stark feature, is that there is a dramatic and quite stark differentiation between places on a whole range of economic indicators. And the point here would be, even within old traditional regions, the performances of cities is quite different. Not only historically current, but actually when we look into the future. So if you think about the cities, the urban areas, the bigger urban areas in the Yorkshire and Humberside region, actually they're quite markedly different. The performance of Leeds to Sheffield to York to Hull, they're all quite different, and often on many of the indicators that we're looking at, they're going in opposite directions. So being able to disaggregate to those cities and understand, or at least to have a better appreciation of what's going on, I think is really quite important. And uniquely, this is all the, I suppose, a build-up of why we have an increasing interest around devolution and around this performance, is because when you look at our big cities in the UK, not just in England and Wales, but actually across the UK, when you look at our big cities on a whole range of different indicators, whether it's business startups, whether it's employment rate, whether it's GVA per worker, they are all underperforming with the exception of London and Bristol, uniquely in the UK compared to particularly some of our European countries. We are markedly different in that our big cities are dragging the national economy rather than pushing it. So these are kind of reasons why then we have our politicians thinking about and talking, this is their language, not necessarily ours, this drive for devolution, as they call it, or the Chancellor calls it, devolution revolution. So it's a political policy context for why this matters, and it picks up on both Martin and John's points around engaging with our users, understanding why users are interested in this issue and these issues, why they're interested in data at small geography levels, in part because it's been driven by some of the policy challenges and policy issues. At the Centre for Cities, we're an independent economic think tank focusing on city performance, the economics of cities. We look at the 63 biggest UK urban areas. That takes you from, on a population basis, takes you from obviously London at 8 and a bit million, down to places like Worthing and Exeter that have a daytime population of 135,000 plus. And there are 63 places across the country there. Some of them straddle, interestingly straddle, more than one local authority. Some of them straddle many local authorities, some are bounded within local authority. But we're looking at these 63 urban areas, the 63 biggest urban areas. And we do a mix of policy, a mix of research, looking at the national performance, the comparative performance on ranges of indicators of these 63 areas, and produce publications, work with cities and with national government to both understand and use it. Trying to make the data that many of you in the room are producing, particularly ONS colleagues are producing, helping our cities, helping national government, but certainly helping our cities to understand what it's saying for them, what it means for them, and making it accessible. In a sense, I think much of the conversation we may have today will be essentially thinking about how more advanced, more sophisticated users can get access to data. I think there's a reminder that there is a long tail of less sophisticated, less engaged users that need help to access the data, never mind, to do further analysis. So thinking about those sorts of things, I think, is quite important. There we produced a data tool which takes 45 data sets covering population, covering skills, covering industrial structure, covering different aspects of innovation, and providing them in a way that users can then plot them and use them to understand how they perform against some of their other places across the UK. The spiky map is jobs density by MSOA level as well, to give an illustration of some of those different ways that the data can be used. So let me briefly touch on challenges. And I want to say, colleagues from ONS, we've had great conversations with Joe and his team, and we continue to have those conversations. Roma, I think, is in the room. I saw her sneak in somewhere. Having conversations with ONS, bringing some of our cities to the table to think about how we can work through all of these sorts of issues. And I offer these observations in that light. In a sense, they are challenges to be overcome on both sides, not criticisms. I'm really keen to make that point. The Centre for Cities is a VML, the Virtual Microdata Lab approved researchers, so we get access to the VML to get in and look at very fine-grained postcode and individual unit level analysis, and that is a brilliant facility. It's allowed us to do fantastic things, and I know there's some great plans and ideas around how we can further expand the VML's capabilities and offers, and I think that is a fantastic area. So I say all of that as way of context. So 5 basic issues. We've talked about this already. The first one is geography. I think particularly thinking about how we get down to local authority and below, and having that stable over time across indicators, I think, is really important. Trying to build from very micro geographies, so then we can flex the geography at which we do our analysis to different postcodes or different geographies, not just up to local authority or indeed beyond, and particularly outside of the census. I think accuracy has already been raised by Martin. Recognizing the limitations of sample-based data when you get down to very small geographies and the confidence levels associated with that. I think some of the ASH data is good, but when you get to small geographies, there are some issues around the sampling, all of that. Timeliness, I think, is a really critical issue, not least because if you poured over some of our data, and in fact nearly all of our data, we are essentially looking at best 1, if not in many respects 2 years into the past. The most up-to-date data we've got on job performance or on business starts, on those sorts of issues, is at least 12 months, if not 24 months into the past. So just thinking about the timeliness of those sorts of issues. And then, if you're thinking you're trying to work with cities and the policymakers in those places about what's going on, some of that delay causes them and obviously has some real challenges. Consistency breaks in data, I think, in the way that data is captured and then analysed, I think, is an issue. And a lot of good stuff around some data sets, but they tend to be one-offs, or some of them are one-offs. And that has implications, I think, for ability to do stuff over the time series. I think BRES is a kind of interesting data set. It's a great data set for us, but there are some time series questions and issues around that. And then I won't rehearse this because I'll get onto this in a second, and then I will finish, Martin. It's just the availability, in the sense that, we know that a lot of data is collected. Both some of the data we see, 12 months down the line, could we release that slightly earlier? But also, I think, there's data collected, administrative data collected, that we definitely could do more with. So dealing with those sorts of issues, as I said, working with Joe and his team, we're trying to grapple with some of those issues, maybe on a pilot basis. I know Alan, following me, will talk a little bit about this. Maybe we can get at addressing some of these challenges on a pilot, almost on a city-by-city basis, as well as thinking about it at a more national perspective. And then, immediate opportunities. and benefits. These have been touched on already. And I think, this is a sense that we need to do more, but actually we know there are existing data sets they've already been talking about. HMRC, PAYE data would be fantastic resource. We are working now with HMRC and their own data lab to get access to some of that, to do some more of that, although I think there are some sample questions that you get down at the very low level. But that would allow us to look at wages, and sector and by occupation at small geographies. Definitely be able to allow us to look at distribution of income at very small levels as well, particularly as we increasingly get concerned about inequality and some of those sort of policy questions. HMRC data would give us a real chance to do that. I think there's a question more generally about government expenditure data. We don't really have a sense at our city level or at our local authority level as to what money is spent by government departments in their different guises in localities. And that very much relates to how we can then deal with public sector reform and efficiency agendas if we don't really know what's been spent and by whom and on what. I think there are some real challenges, but there is data out there again, so I think we could do more around that. And then my third area would be land use data. Some of our colleagues in CLG hold some great data on this, but access to it, I think, is a little bit restricted for some of the reasons that we've heard from Sir Charles and some others. Just having a better understanding of the value of land, particularly boundaries. We do quite a bit of work around housing constraints and issues around land use, and there's some problems, I think, around just understanding where the boundaries are, and actually land use. What use is land actually being used for is not as straightforward as we would ideally want. And I put some of these better understanding of city growth, better policy design, better policy evaluation, because that's really where we start from. In a sense, we can get into a conversation about can we get more data to do more interesting analysis and understand more. That's really important. But it's what we're trying to do with that data, what we're trying to do with those insights that should really drive this agenda, I think, as much as anything else. And I do some work with the What Works Centre for Local Economic Growth with Henry Overman and others at LSE, and we're kind of thinking continually about how better data would give us better insights. How do we design policy to improve the performance of cities, and indeed how we can then evaluate them as well. So I think those are sorts of some of the issues. I'll skip over that. Hopefully that's given you a sense as to the user perspective, what we're trying to do, what some of those challenges are, how we're trying to overcome them. And then I think some of the immediate wins which pick up already on some of the points that have already been made. Thank you very much.
I'm speaking to you today as the Chief Economic Advisor to the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. I'm one of the few people so far who's got the Greater Manchester Combined Authority in his title, but there'll be a lot more of us next year. And I'm representing probably one of the most developed sets of analysts within the public service community at a local level in the country. I think Greater Manchester and London are leading the way in terms of assembling the analytical capacity, which is increasingly, I would argue, going to be more and more important as we go on the devolution journey. And we don't quite know where that's going to end. But what we do know is that analytic capacity and good sources of data and good analysis of that data are going to be increasingly important to all of us. But I'm also speaking to you as somebody who's only just taken up that job. So I'm representing a part of the user community in responding to the report today. But I spent 30 years previous to that as an academic. And I was really interested in Charlie Bean's observations about the way in which academics respond to data sources and the limitations thereof. I agree with him, actually, that what, as academics, I used to do, as an academic I used to do, was to live more or less comfortably or uncomfortably with many of the limitations of the standard data sets that we get from ONS and others, and try and think of ways in which we could develop fresh, empirical, original research to get beyond those limitations. When you get into a context like the one I'm in now, you begin to see that it's not so easy for policymakers to get beyond those limitations, because we don't have endless resources to spend on research projects, and we need to deliver results pretty quickly because we've got political lords and masters to respond to. So I want to welcome the report on behalf of Greater Manchester. I do think it's a very timely study, And I think the topics that we've got for discussion later on the agenda today are pretty well chosen. And many of the things which are being picked up today are the sorts of things that Greater Manchester responded to the original review. So I won't go through a list of those. Needless to say, we are very reliant on standard ONS statistics within Greater Manchester, whether that's GDP, GVA, employment and business numbers, productivity, wages, firm startups and survivals, the whole panoply of economic and related data is part of our routine bread and butter. And in our response to the review, we picked up many of the things which Andrew has talked about in the previous address to you. Issues about time lags get in the way of good analysis sometimes. Issues about productivity in particular. We're revisiting at the moment the productivity puzzle. Is a genuine puzzle, I think, but it has a very strong spatial dimension to it. And that's something we're beginning to work on in Manchester, but it's not something that's easy to get at. The puzzle is not easily soluble through the statistics we've currently got. There were issues to do with consistency, about adjustment of figures over time, all of the sorts of issues to do with the new economy and how we measure it. We're struggling with these things on a daily basis. So rather than go through all of those limitations, I want to just zero in on something that Andrew mentioned, which I think is geography is absolutely critical to all of this. I think understanding the nature of the new economy is primarily about understanding the importance of our principal urban areas. And I think we need to invest significantly more in that understanding. And that's a relational understanding. What we're doing in Greater Manchester all the time is trying to look at the performance of the city region in relation to the national statistics, and also internationally, benchmarking ourselves against international performers. What we also need to tell a story about locally, and a compelling narrative is an important part of what we do. It's absolutely essential that we understand the interrelationships between the different parts of our own city region, and that's something that the nature of statistics doesn't easily allow us to do at the present time. I think, bizarrely, we talk about the limits of surveys and data based on surveys. I think if we can't get to the point where, at least at a local authority level, we have statistics which are genuinely robust and useful, we need to think again about how we make those sorts of investments, because it's the local authority level which is scalable up. Many of the things that Andrew was showing you are collections of local authorities. That's the basic level of analysis, I think, where we absolutely need our surveys to deliver for us, because on top of that we can do much else that we need to do in terms of analysing the new geography of the UK economy. So that point about geography, I think, is something that we need a lot more thinking about. That thinking is going on in various places. Andrew mentioned the What Works Centre for Local Economic Growth, which we're also a partner in. So some of the analytical challenges are being aired in those sorts of environments. What we need to do is to bring the people thinking about those things together with the data producers and the data analysts in the way which has already been discussed, I think. So I want to leave these comments, welcome the study, welcome the conclusions, very happy to work alongside ONS and others in meeting some of the challenges which we'll be going through today. I think the journey towards devolution is going to make a fundamental difference to the way in which we view the issues that we're discussing today. We're going to be moving to what appears to be a very asymmetrical set of institutional arrangements in the UK. That's not completely unknown internationally, but it's a very new set of territories for us to begin to grapple with. And what it seems to me is that there is a fantastic book which I think that all statisticians should read, by a guy called Jim Scott, who's an anthropologist actually, he's not an economist. It's a book called Seeing Like a State. And in that book, he looks at the way in which over centuries, systems of measurement have been developed by nation states, or national power brokers, if you like, in order to be able to track and understand populations, be they individuals or firms, and the way in which that provides a national lens on the way we understand places. I think we're moving to a situation which is very different from that, and which he hints at in the book, which is that in order to understand the way in which places really work, you don't need a national set of prescriptions. You need some real deeply ingrained organic understanding about localities. And I think we've got an opportunity with this review to start to do what Andrew was talking about earlier on, which is to be much more experimental in the way we think about understanding particular places. We've got an enormous amount of analytic capacity in Greater Manchester to do that, and we welcome the opportunity to work with others in taking that agenda forward. Thank you.
How much is the UK economy under-measured? So how much is the degree of under-measurement of the GDP or economic activities? Because of the new development of the digital economy and other these new dimensions. Is there any consensus on it?
Am I right? That was a question about under-measurement.
Under-measurement, yes. Are we better off than what we see in the data?
Well, how far that's a regional issue? You can have under-measurement regionally, and you can have under-measurement nationally. If I could just offer a few thoughts of what I understand is done at the moment, that the final estimates of national income are produced largely from tax data, income tax data, corporation tax data, and so on. Now, those obviously run the risk of under-measurement and inference because people don't draw inferences from them. There are classic problems of the size of the black economy and how far that's not covered. The definition of GDP changed recently to include income generated from illegal activities, and there obviously must be questions how precisely you think you can measure that. I wouldn't come to the presumption that GDP, as defined officially, is under-measured, because statisticians obviously, as best they can, make attempts to correct for known biases. But anyway, if I could perhaps see if there are any regional thoughts on that.
No. Do you want to go?
I don't think so. I wouldn't have a clear sense as to how that plays out in different parts. I think there is definitely a difference in localities around the degree of understanding of what's going on. I think in some places, probably you can get a better understanding of what's going on given the statistics that we've got. In other places, we're probably more out depending on the nature of that place. But the mismeasurement issue in terms of is there a gap, I think is slightly different.
Yeah. I think hopefully by the end of the day we'll have gone through some of the topic areas. If we really do get a programme of work to nail down some of those issues, we'd have a much better prospect of answering your question, I think.
Okay, please, lady there, and then the gentleman.
Thank you. I think my question covers a bit of both the presentations this morning. I'm very interested in what you've said about the cities and the local measurements of local authority areas. But for me, regional statistics, I think, goes further. I think it also goes on to firm level data and onto the sectors. And I think you have to see that there's a lot going on that Eurostat does that does take a lot of regional measurements in terms of surveys. They have structural business surveys, they have innovation surveys, labor surveys. And I think what I've noticed is that is very, very much so missing in the UK analytical area. There are shortages in the analysis and in the provision of that data. And I think on a regional level, at city level, you want to actually know what's going on in sectors, and you can only cover that by samples because you won't get all the firms to, perhaps, I could be wrong in that judgment, to supply you that data. So I think it would be good to, whilst I agree, administrative data is very good, if we could have access to it. I think something has to be done to improve what we already have, but I think which is being underutilized is all this survey data. I see Germany, France, Italy do much more with the analysis of this data than is presently done in the UK. Yeah. Sorry, very long one.
Sorry, could I make one observation
Yes.
on that, or two observations on that, which is that different countries seem to have different rules on giving access to data. And I mean, actually, I've run into difficulty with the Eurostat rules because I wanted to do some work with the European Labour Force Survey for a talk I was giving about the labour market internationally, and wasn't allowed access to them on the grounds that I was a policy maker and not a researcher. So, there are these difficulties, but my sense is that at some cost, it is, if you are a researcher and not a policy maker, it is possible to obtain data from, microdata from Eurostat on the same basis throughout the European Union.
You're right, Martin, but that is publicly available data on sector level for everybody and on regional level for everybody. The microdata, yes, you're right. But if you go on the Eurostat and navigation trees, you'll find the access is there. So, but not the microdata, you're right.
No, I mean, with issues of microdata, obviously there are disclosure problems, and the ONS has actually made it, we'd all like them to go further, but they have made an awful lot of progress in making microdata available to researchers over the last few years. I think everyone.
I think it's excellent. It's just, can we bring what is sort of collected there to a UK level would be, I don't know, maybe it's not right.
Well, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think I can see Joe itching to say so, but I think, as I said to you, we're an approved researcher, and therefore we get access to, via the VML, to fantastic, firm level, very small geography level, individual firm records through the BSD, the Business Structures Database. So that, I think that there's always more to be done. But if you're in the approved researcher bracket, I think that gives you wonderful access to the raw material to do analysis at very different geographies. But I think there's an interesting question around data availability, which you were talking about. Data usage by the more common user, I think, is a bigger question. For 95% of the cities that we work with on a daily or weekly basis, they don't have the resources or the capacity or the capabilities to access the VML in the way that we've, fortunately do, in the way that probably New Economy and several others do. So I think, there's a big question for us. It's a great question to have, which is this wonderful bits of data that we can use to really get some great insights. Can we make it more accessible and more user-friendly to a wider range of constituents, not just those that are super users, and to use a sort of colloquial term. And then I think there's another interesting question about who's doing the analysis. I think the relevance between someone taking the data and then doing that analysis and making that publicly available, as opposed to making some of the raw data available to others to do some analysis. And I think there's some interesting space around that we probably haven't quite got that right either.
Is there any thought further?
I think it's the stuff about whether data is there to be analysed or whether we've got the capacity to analyse it and what the rights and obligations and stuff are is an interesting area, actually. What we typically do is try and work alongside researchers locally if we have expertise nationally or internationally. If we haven't, but that whole issue about data protection and and rights of access and channels is something which I think we should have a further look at, particularly in the context of what we're talking about in terms of releasing administrative data. And I think we all recognise that we can do an awful lot better in terms of the way in which we get data sets to speak to one another. But those access issues become very powerful once you go down that track.
There was a gentleman, please.
Hi, it's Stephen Clark from Resolution Foundation. I had a two-part question about admin data. First of which is, what are the chances do you think there will be a lot more made available in the near future, which would help with the kind of things you've been discussing? And the second question is on, kind of for, I suppose, more Alan, but with there being devolution of a lot of administrative functions, do you think that the new local authority, regional governments will be collecting admin data, and will they face the same constraints upon releasing that to researchers? Because I can imagine in 10 years' time we might be having the same discussion about people wanting to analyse the Manchester economy using admin data. So, thanks. Yeah.
Alan, would you like to start?
Maybe I could start with that one. And we've certainly got aspirations. I mean, there's a lot of work which is beginning to be done, linked to the devolution agenda in Greater Manchester about various pilot programs, particularly in the areas of public service reform, which are absolutely reliant on the recombination and calibration of admin data. Colleagues who've done that work could tell you a better story than I can about some of the difficulties of being able to do that, particularly around information requirements and secrecy and that sort of stuff. But we've done pretty well, I think, in terms of being able to design innovative services around the combination of admin data. And I can only see that becoming more important in the future. I think our commitment is to try and open up that dialogue about the limitations that are placed on us at the moment. But I go back to my sort of original comments. I think you can only really do that on the basis of places, because what we find, certainly in terms of working with government on devolution and devolution deals, is that there's a very powerful set of messages come from government about things having to have a particular purpose. So there's no commitment to a general opening up of administrative data, but there is quite a lot of leeway, I think, in terms of trying to demonstrate that you can only achieve certain things if you can use intelligence in particular ways. So a really powerful message to go forward, I think, is how can we begin to make progress on that on an experimental area by area basis as devolution proceeds. Yeah.
Well, it's Monday morning, so let's be optimistic. I think for the reasons that we heard from John and Sir Charles, I think over the next 5 or 10 years, or in the medium term, I think we will see more administrative data being made available. Maybe not at the speed that we would all want it to happen and quite in the way, but I think if we look back in 5 years' time, I think I hope we will have said that we've made some real good progress at opening up some of that administrative data. So it's Monday morning. I'm going to be trying optimistic on those sorts of things. I've nothing to add to Alan's point on the second part of your question, although I think it is increasingly interesting that the incentives to experiment and to use data as part of the experimentation process are becoming much more real at the local level than they were 5 years ago. In a sense, the gains from better understanding how your place works, how your policy then influences, hopefully for the better, how that place works, and the gains that can be had are much sharper today than they were a few years ago, and I think they will be even sharper in 5 years' time. But my final point on this, we often get into a national sort of conversation. Actually, I think part of the national conversation is fantastic because it drives local actors to hopefully behave in a similar way as well, to engage local authorities and groups or individual to open up their data sets and their administrative information, so then we can link it and we can understand it. And there needs to be a bit of to-ing and fro-ing on that. And I hope that, and I see it, but both parties have roles to play in opening up that agenda.
John, would you be able to add anything to the prospects of administrative data becoming more readily available beyond what Charlie had?
Well, yes, why not? I mean, we've talked about the legislation, and obviously that is a matter for Parliament, and that will roll forward, but there's several of us, and we've certainly been very strong on it. Charlie's been very strong on it, many others have, so there's probably a better time than there's ever been in my career for something to happen on that legislative front. But I observe that a lot of the problems are much more kind of institutional and cultural. Yeah. And I think we can look at where people have cracked the problems and try to replicate them. So my favourite example, not particularly specifically relevant to cities, but I think is a relevant way of opening up sensitive records, is what the Ministry of Justice have done with their data lab. And that has brought together some very sensitive information in a really secure environment that enables people working with offenders at local levels to understand what works with particular rehabilitation programs and other things. And I think the point about being specific is really well made. If there is a really good case for data actually making a difference to the way people's lives are run or an economy is performing, then why would you say no to it?
Yeah.
So I think we need to get much cleverer at articulating the benefits case for all of this.
Yeah.
And so the more we can bring that together, the better we will be. And I mean, we are working very hard on that so that when anything does come before Parliament, we can say to members of both houses, look, give us these powers and we'll be able to help Manchester develop a programme. We'll be able to help this group do better off. We'll be able to help people make better choices. So I think that is the challenge. I agree very much with what both Andrew and Alan have said in their presentations. Let's get it down to kind of reality. This isn't a blanket thing we want for a blanket purpose.
No,
this is a specific thing. It's going to help specific things improve.
Well, thank you very much for that, those observations. Gentlemen at the back there, and no, I think that needs to be the last question before lunch, or the last point before lunch.
Thank you. Dave Verdi, with about 25 years of experience in working in regional sistex, a lot of it in ONS. One of the, I suppose the point I wanted to make or question is more for John and the review as a whole. John, I really welcome this whole review and the recommendations, and also John's recognition that we've had previous reviews with giving emphasis to regional local sistex and other aspects, but then they go down and we have to come back to revisit them. I think regional and local sistex is a particular case in example. We had a huge input to the topic back in 2000, spending review with neighbourhood sistex. Previously we had a big sort of impetus when local authorities were reorganised back in the 1990s. With the Allsop review we had the regional statisticians and other sort of impetus as well. But each time, once the spending cuts come around at any times of recession or other sort of reasons, regional seems to be the first aspect that gets cut or goes down the priority list. And also there are a lot of lessons to be learned from those previous examples. Neighbourhood sistex gave us quite a lot of, almost like a statistical infrastructure, the statistical output areas that can be used as building blocks for any high level geographies. But largely they were used on the social side and a bit less so on the economic side. So how can we sort of make use of those while we still have these challenges of getting access to administrative data? At that time we came up with a sort of a solution, which was that at source the department that owns the data would aggregate to those small areas, disclosure check, and then share it with ONS so that it could be aggregated up to different levels. And those methods could still be applied, but the whole of that sort of methodology seems to be sort of dormant in a sense and ticking over with a few data sets and not being applied more widely because we're now trying to meet this other challenge of getting access to all data that's held in administrative systems. Similarly with the regional statisticians and the Allsop review generally, that was a great way of actually getting local regional knowledge into ONS and getting expertise on ONS statistics to the regions. So they were working with local partners, and one example that comes to mind is in the northeast, they wanted a lot more information on the chemical sector, and our statistician in the region at the time was able to do a lot of work with the industry and with access to ONS data to bring a real benefit to knowledge about that sector in that region. But again, when the RDAs were scrapped, the regional statisticians posts also disappeared. But it's another way that we can actually garner more local knowledge, feed it both ways. It needs to be a partnership between users and producers, and those posts were part funded by the regional development agencies. But last point, I suppose, is there are other local partners as well. For example, the Bank of England has a network of local agents who actually have a lot of intelligence. I think they gather a lot of information. And how can that be made not necessarily readily available, but that knowledge could be shared a bit more widely. Just finding other ways of adding to the knowledge on the regions, the cities, and so on. But just some observations really there over the last 20 years.
Please.
Great, Jen. You know, I mean, I don't disagree with what you're saying. A lot of this stuff. So, firstly, a lot of this stuff is happening. You know, particularly you make this point at the end about Bank of England. I'm going to be at a session tomorrow in Newcastle talking about use of land and land in the northeast as a hindrance for economic development. The Bank of England are contributing to that conversation. So the week after, there's a discussion on London. The Bank of England agent will be at that conversation telling us about, you know, from a Bank of England's point of view, what's going on in London. So I think at the local level, a lot of the stuff that you're talking about is happening. So you may not see it, and it may not be captured at the national level, but the fact that these things are happening all the time, always more can be done. I think that would be my one point. I mean, your other point, I go back. I wouldn't underestimate the sharpening and growing demand from users like New Economy, Greater Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds, Bristol, particularly some of the bigger places, but others as well, over the next 5 years. The demand that they will place on government and government agencies to provide them with useful and real-time information to help them run their places is going to be critical, and the fallout from not being able to do that will be very, very sharp indeed. Whereas before, the imperative to do this sort of stuff was blunted and diluted through intermediaries that didn't really have a play in the locality. That is shifting, and I think the demand from users at the local level to understand their place, and for those that they know have this information and are not making it available, that will become increasingly difficult to resist.
Alan?
I'd agree wholeheartedly with that. I think the pressure that we see now is very much related to the devolution movement, and I see that as pretty unstoppable over the next few years. We wouldn't have anticipated that we'd be having a debate about city regional geographies and the importance of city regions 10, 15 years ago in the same way that we're doing now. And it does have its own impact in terms of the demands on data providers. So that's going to be a challenge for government. I agree entirely that, you know, it's I think particularly when we lived with administrative structures based on the old administrative regions, it was very easy for people in charge of cuts to say, well, this is mere regional interest. I don't think we're in that place anymore. What we lack, and going back to my main point really, I think we lack the models of bringing the various voices together around particular places in order to do that. So, you know, we've had those conversations individually with HMRC or DWP or ONS, a whole set of data providers. We draw on our own administrative data. We have some dealings with the university over research and intelligence around data. Actually having a mechanism that we can all learn from, which brings those things together around an agenda for a particular place, I would see as a major step forward.
Well, no, there's plainly a great deal to do, but we have run more than 5 minutes into the lunch break, so I would like to bring this session to an end, please, and to thank both our speakers.